welcome, everybody. My guest this week is Clive Thompson, author of a fascinating book on coding, which I happen to have right here. I've learned a lot. Like, I did not know that Hello World was a thing. Like, I didn't know that was where this all started. It's amazing, and the book is really revealing. But aside from the book, Clive has written a bunch of other books. He's also actually a really rare creature making a living as a journalist. So I think so Clive writes for the New York Times science section, has a regular column in Wired, and sort of appears in many, many different wonderful places. And I just thought it would be so interesting in this moment where, science and technology and society are all coming together to kind of catch up with you and see. So maybe start with your story a little bit, because I think it is really interesting.
So one of the reasons I'm interested in software and people who make it is that I'm of the age where I was a young teenager in the early 80s, and this was the first time that these sort of like the first generation of personal computers came out. And these are these things that it was just released a keyboard with computer guts, and you plugged it into your TV, use your TV as a monitor.
I remember
that. Commodore 64, TRS-80, VIC-20, machines like that, Sinclair ZX81. And these started emerging around, 1980-ish. And for the next kind of 4 or 5 years, that really was the first part of personal computing. And what was significant about them is that they did not ship with any software, right? So you open it up and you turned it on, and all there was a little prompt for you to type in code, right? Like if you wanted it to do something, you had to program it yourself. There was really not, like, there quickly emerged like a market for software that you could buy, like, you could send away for a cassette tape and it would have software on it, and you load your cassette tape, or eventually with disk drives like years later. But really what this did was it was sort of an open invitation to learn to program, because the other thing, they all shipped with a book on how to program in BASIC, right? So like it was a very interesting moment it's become sort of a significant thinking point for how to train coders today. It turns out that if you make it easy to do when you have free time when you're a teenager, you can get a lot of programmers out. Because a lot. I did not become a programmer because my family, I was very, very into it, but my mother did not want the family to have a computer in the house, because she was worried that I would just do nothing but play video games. Like she, which is true, kids play a lot of video games on them, but she didn't understand that it was also this open gateway to coding. So I had like one summer when my father's friend lent us his VIC-20, and I programmed on it from 8 in the morning to 2 in the morning for 4 months. But that was kind of it for my personal ownership of computers. So I was very into computers, but never became a programmer, because it turns out that if you close off a kid's access to the machineries, they go and do something else, which in my case was writing, right? But I remained interested in it, and a lot of my friends that I was coding with, I'd go to other houses and we'd code on their computers. They actually did become software developers.
You say in the book that writing and coding have a lot,
very similar,
parallel.
So I get interested in that. And then when I became a journalist, I studied just English and political science, but I did campus journalism at the University of Toronto. And then I decided I wanted to become a journalist. There was not really any work when I graduated, because it was a pretty bad recession in the early 90s in Canada. But I decided just to freelance, which is, polite way of not really having a full-time, gig, basically. And because because by the mid 90s, the internet was coming along, it's beginning to enter the mainstream. None of the boomers wanted to, and they were the ones running the media back then. They didn't want to write about this. They didn't think it was that interesting, but they understood it was a story, but they wanted just someone else to write about it. So that was my entry point to magazine journalism. I would write stories mostly for the business press up in Canada about the emerging internet companies and internet service providers and whatnot. And that became my route into writing for magazines. And I sort of gravitated towards writing. Mostly I was interested in their impact on society. It turns out the business models I don't find interesting at all. I mean, they're interesting, I guess, but I could care less about who wins or loses some particular fight for dominance. What really attracted me was the ways in which it was altering the way people communicated. It created new forms of ways for people to understand what's going on in the lives of people around them and the world around them. New expressive capabilities as you began to see people's literacies emerge in things that were beyond text. And so that essentially became what I write about. The reason why I wrote Coders is because after doing that, for 20 years, journalism like that, I enjoyed it. But I also realized, when I would talk to people or, get response from readers, that most people, they didn't really understand much about how software comes to be. It's a real, it's a real black box. They have a visual sense of other difficult spheres of influence. Like if you ask them how is the engine of a car made, they would have some vague idea that you have to get metal and you have to make these components and put them together cleverly, and then so that it burns gasoline. They don't know the specifics, but they have a vague idea of what's going on there. And if you ask them how a root canal works, they don't really know, but they know you have to go in there and mess around with the teeth and fix them. Like they have a but if you ask them how TikTok came to be, it is just an absolute blank. It's as if it was beamed down from a UFO. They have no clue at all. So the book was essentially an attempt to, explain what goes on in the creation of software, and what types of people are attracted to it, what types of people sort of tend to thrive in it, and what implications that has for the type of software that gets made. So
it's a fascinating read. I really encourage anybody who's got an interest in this topic, independent of what Clive's life is like, but really interesting. So you open the book with the story of the Facebook news feed.
Yeah.
And one of the there's several really intriguing things about that. Firstly, the person who was one of the leading characters is a woman. And
yep.
In the book, you actually write a lot about women, which
totally.
Most technical books don't do that. Like they're the sort of hidden figure
totally.
behind the scenes. But what intrigues me about the newsfeed was that the initial reaction was so negative, and yet
Yeah, the news feed. I mean, I started the book with it because I think it's probably one of the most significant pieces of software of the last 20 years. Because it's almost hard for people to remember what Facebook was like before the newsfeed came along. So before the newsfeed came along, you would log into Facebook, and if you wanted to see what a friend had posted, you had to go to look at their Facebook page, right? And if you forgot to check their Facebook page, you would not see what they had posted, right? And if you had hundreds of friends, quickly that becomes you can't do that, or you just forget about most of them. And it was like as if everyone had like their own blog, and you had to go and look at that blog, kind of, there was, Zuckerberg had been interested for some time in this idea of like a sort of a scrolling feed that would just pick the most recent things out and just provide them to everyone. And he'd been sort of mapping this out. So he had the idea, and he needed a team of people to do it. And back then, I mean, this was the early days of Facebook, really 2 years in. And so they would just move to San Francisco, and they were really having trouble getting like serious software developers to work for them because, people that were like senior or had any sort of experience in Silicon Valley did not really think that social networking was going to become a big thing. Like it seemed like another potential like little trend, like, oh, everyone's going to do these, put these little messages online for their friends. And it's going to be really big for 2 years and it's going to vanish. Mm-hmm. So not everyone wanted to stop what they're doing. So they actually would hire kind of, I wouldn't say they would hire anyone that showed up, but like the bar was, like they were hungry for talent. They were hungry for people that got it, that understood, Facebook's massive appeal and impact. And as it turns out, so Ruchi Sanghvi, she was the woman who was in the book. She was she'd originally done computer science and gone off to work for a job at a bank in Manhattan, and literally couldn't do it. Like she resigned on the first day because it just seemed so boring. She wanted to she had that real hunger to affect the lives of millions of people. So she went to Silicon Valley and she worked for Oracle. If I'm remembering that correctly, I think it was Oracle, database company, something like that. Anyway, and a friend of hers said, well, you should come by and hang out with Facebook one day, like I'm visiting. And she'd used Facebook. So she knew about it. And she was really excited by that. And it turns out they needed engineers. So they hired her. And she was like a very early hire. And I believe their first female engineering hire. And then Mark said, okay, you're going to be on this team of 4 people or around 4 people that's going to make this thing. And they spent about 9 months on it. And when it was released, because it was so different, it really unsettled people because, it was using Facebook had a lot of friction in it. Like when you had to go and look at everyone's page, that was slow, right? And when it got sped up, when suddenly you were given every single change to the person did, it felt like too much information. And people were worried about their own, they realized that although it was slow and painful as a user to figure out what's going on with other people, as a person who has a page that you're updating, you might appreciate or like the fact that it's hard to see what you're doing, right? Like that when you posted something, the only people that saw it were the ones that actively really wanted to check it out. It felt very exposed now to have everything you do suddenly flow outwards. That was sort of the there's Dana Boyd is this wonderful thinker in technology.
He's amazing.
Wonderful. And she has this phrase that is really, really a phenomenal way to think about social media and privacy. She says, taking something that is already public and making it more public is an act that has serious privacy implications, right? Because typically we think of privacy as an all or nothing thing. Either you don't put it online at all, or once it's online, hey, it's your fault. It's everywhere, right? And her point is and you can see this in the reactions to people with this first piece of code, this news feed, that they put their thing online, but and they made it public, but they made it public in a way that they understood some friction and slowness to it. And when Facebook sped it up, they took something that you had put online and they made it more public. That felt like a privacy violation. And I think it's worthwhile thinking about that moment because we actually live with those moments over and over and over and over again now, right? Where things are put online in one context, we think it's just for that context, goes everywhere. And that feels like a privacy violation. That's exactly what Dana pointed out. And that's exactly what happened. Because when Ruchi, and her team hit go on this thing, it was just a flood of abuse coming in. Everyone hated it. And there was these pages put up on Facebook, like Ruchi is the devil and stuff like that, because people were very, very unsettled by this. And so the one of the things I started the book that way is because everyone knows newsfeed. Not everyone remembers, what it felt like to change into it. But that social moment where a small number of people change the experience of millions of people and they freak out is sort of like a perfect object lesson for the ways in which software developers and software companies affect the world around us.
It's amazing. And of course, we're this particular moment in history, we're seeing the widespread social consequences of forces, frankly, they're beyond anybody's control.
Well, I mean, this is the thing that that some of the people said to me when I was later on in the book. I talk about the problems of social media that's become so huge that like Facebook, that it's billion, hundreds of millions, billions of users, and I was asking people, clearly Mark Zuckerberg doesn't seem to have a good grip on what he's doing. Who would be a better person to run it? And they all said no one. It's ungovernable. Something at that scale is no longer something that any human or group of humans, no matter how smart or committed, can manage. Basically,
can grasp. Yeah. And that has pretty scary implications.
Yes, it does.
And I mean, one of the things I talk about a lot is the difference between complicated systems and complex ones, where complicated ones, it's like a Boeing 747. It's got 4 million parts, but you pretty much know where it's going to go once you launch it into the air.
It's pretty deterministic.
Yeah. Whereas a complex system has all these interconnections, and you don't know where it's going to end up given the starting conditions. And so I think one of the things that human beings are really, really bad at is complex systems with exponential effects. Where the
and the way that Silicon Valley tends to deal with that problem is they basically say, well, we'll deal with the complexity in production, which is we will produce a minimal version of this product,
Mhm.
aware that it's going to do like, we can foresee 10 things it's going to do.
Mhm.
And we can foresee maybe 5 things we don't want happening. We've kind of maybe tried to deal with those,
Mhm.
but we know there's going to be a bunch of stuff that we don't know. And we're just going to observe it as it's used, and then we'll deal with it, one by one. And there's 2 problems there. One is that, well, that's fine maybe if it's just like a to-do app, right? And its impact on the civil realm is minimal, right? It's like, okay, we didn't expect people to do this with our to-do app. We're gonna change that. We're gonna here's a little example.
Mhm.
When Google Sheets, or so Google Docs was originally a company called Writely, right?
I didn't know that.
Before it was bought by Google, it was a little company that said, we are going to produce a word processor that is going to live in the cloud, so that you don't have to have the documents on your desk. Now, so they produced this, and I talked to the one of the heads years ago, and he said, well, when we originally put it online, we had a list of things we wanted to do. Like, it was really just a simple box. You could type into it and you could save the document. It was very minimal, right? And our to-do list, the things we wanted to put on there, this is what he tells me, was to make it look like Word. Like, we wanted lots of nice fonts. We wanted to be able to format things, have bulleted lists and paragraph indents. We wanted you to be able to generate a document that looked as good. Right now, it was just crap. It was like just plain text practically. They wanted it to look that way. But all the users uniformly said, we don't give a crap about Microsoft Word formatting. We want to be able to collaboratively work in a document with other people. If this thing is online, I want my friends to log into it. I want us all to work on that at the same time. And so the software developers had this vision of what they were building that was utterly different from what people actually wanted it to do. And to their credit, they said, all right, so let's just scrap all the, it took like years for Google Docs to develop anything remotely approaching fonts, but they spent all their energy making it possible to collaborate on a document and to even be in there live at the same time, because that's what people wanted. So you can see immediately how like software developers can have a completely different idea of what people are going to want. Like they want what they want, and that's not necessarily what the public's going to want to use. So it's a series of surprises, and unfortunately, they're not. Like, it's a combination of they can be terrible at reacting to the problems that their products cause. They can have their heads in the sand because they don't want to think about it. They can not notice those problems because they don't affect them personally, which is sort of like the problem I talk about in the book with a lot of people. I talked to early people on Twitter, early Twitter developers, and they were like, yeah, here's the thing. It was all a bunch of young white guys, and they don't really get, a lot of coordinated abuse. That might get people saying that what you said is stupid, or,
Right.
you're dumb and go away. But they don't get the thing where like 20 people decide, let's make this person's life miserable for a week, and just like dogpiling, let's coordinate abuse. So there's a new piece of abuse happening every 5 minutes. We're going to do this nonstop for a week. That's dogpiling. And that's what happened, let's say, during Gamergate, right? So they were intellectually unequipped to understand that as a problem because it was so outside their experience. Nothing like that had happened to anyone they ever knew. And they didn't bother to do the basic user research to figure out, well, what might go wrong here, right? Which they could have done. If you looked at like even Usenet in the 90s, you would have seen that, particularly women voicing opinions, as Penny Red said, an opinion is a short skirt of the internet for women, right?
That's a great phrase.
You could have learned from that in the 90s, but they didn't. They just said, hey, we have this idea, it's gonna be great, and we're gonna go out there and just offer this new tool that is going to be fantastic for for a lot of guys, and fantastic with massive problems for a lot of women. Right?
I'm reminded of Microsoft's launch of Tay. Remember Tay?
Oh God.
But you talk about, here's another case where this is such a smart company, such smart people. Well, maybe we should tell the story just for those that haven't heard it. I don't know if you want to tell it.
Okay, yeah, sure. So Tay basically was Microsoft was very interested in chatbot technology. This was what, 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, thereabouts, maybe 7. Chatbots are becoming kind of a hot thing. And one of the challenges of the chatbot is that if you wanted to reply to people convincingly, you're stuck sort of writing a response for everything anyone might say to it. And that becomes a challenge because, there's a potentially infinite number of things people could say to it. And you are just one human, or you're four people in a room trying to like war game. Well, what if it says, how's the weather? What if it says that, So one way around that is to allow it to sort of learn things from the users themselves, right? To sort of apply AI, machine learning, to essentially synthesize from things that people are saying to it or things that it observes being said, online, responses. And so, the problem is that when they put this thing online, it immediately started learning some of the most incredibly racist, horrific, pro-Nazi things that people say online. And they hadn't put in like and clearly people were intentionally sort of saying racist things to it, like to get it to pick them up, right?
It became a whole
which again, they'd not expected. They'd assumed reasonable good faith in the people that interact with it. And the way traditionally, you would, if you're writing a chatbot, the way you would deal with this is you would have a massive, list, a stop word list, do not let my bot say, X, Y, or Z, which, can work for 90% of things. You can, it'll keep you from saying, obvious epithets. Clearly, it can, it's not perfect. Like, if someone teaches your bot to say, hey, women are property, there's no word in that sentence that connotes it's the combination of them, and AI hitherto is quite terrible at understanding the semantics of a sentence, right? So anyway, they ran into this problem, and they had this bot that just became very rapidly, a matter of like days, if not hours.
It was 2 days. It was like 2 days.
And days, it became like a spouting all sorts of Nazi and racist stuff, and they had to take it down. So yeah, it's another example of software, like when you talk about they're trying to create a system. They're trying to think about complexity, but they're mostly thinking about determinism. And the complex stuff is people, right? When you talk about complex systems, what you're really talking about are people and how people deal with it. And that is always every like software story I've done has run afoul. Like I wrote about voting machines in 2008. The touchscreen ones, right? And they were a real nightmare. And for example, there was this thing known as a dragging finger bug, where on this very popular model of voting machine, you would get unexpected crashes, and no one could figure out why. And what it was that someone would touch the screen and go to touch another area, but not lift their finger sufficiently off it. And the software was written on top. So like there's voting machine software, but there's an operating system. Same way that like, if you have a Windows machine, you run Word, and underneath that is Windows, right? And Windows is helping you run Word. So the voting machine software is up here. Below that is what's called Windows CE, which was actually always kind of a pretty dreadful operating system. Anyway, they had forgotten to write code that would recognize someone dragging their finger. So when that happened, it was Windows CE that was left with the responsibility to figure out, well, what the hell is going on? We're seeing like an XY coordinate just going down straight, right? Windows CE interprets that as drag and drop, because that's the only time people does something out of Windows CE. And so it invoked this drag and drop thing, and the whole thing just went kablooey, right? And so there you go, classic example.
Absolutely.
Happens all the darn time. So again, this is fine if you're dealing with a video game, where if it crashes, who cares? Or if you're dealing with TikTok and or like counts on Instagram. I mean, if it's off, but your like counts are off, whatever. But if you're talking about banking or voting or heart rate monitors, or something where like precision matters, now you have a whole different problem. And when software is unregulated, those heart rate monitors, those are regulated. But when software is unregulated, as social software is, you have some real interesting potential problems on your hands.
Absolutely. So one of the things you talk about is the personalities of the people that are drawn to coding. And I just think the portrayal of them in the book is really interesting, that they get in this zone and it's like addictive almost, that they get in this flow and you can't interrupt them. And it's very hard for them to look, as you said, beyond that, to see what the consequences
of the
things that they're doing.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, like it's very, coding is an enormously fun and intellectually exciting thing to do. I mean, I do enough of it myself that I recognize that it's extraordinarily existentially and philosophically and artistically and creatively a wonderful, wonderful thing. This is one of the reasons why I was attracted to it. Was like I really like coders, and I really like
it comes through in the book.
Yeah, I really like the sort of craft of it. I love the art of it. I love the science of it. The people who are attracted to it are often incredibly interesting and funny and witty and weird and cool. And so, but it's very all engrossing, right? You know, and it's a series of like, you know, problems. You know, like no one really writes a big piece of software. What they really write is they break it down into like hundreds of little steps, and they figure out how to accomplish that step. And that can be really hard. You might spend days or weeks on one tiny little step, right? You know, and so, you know, like for example, I'm currently writing a piece of software that I live in Brooklyn here, and you have to move your car. You park it on the streets, but you know, if you park it on what's known as the Thursday side, on Thursday at 9:30 in the morning, from 9:30 to 11, it cannot be there. So you have to move it. If you forget to move it, you get a ticket, $65. I get a lot of tickets because I forget to move it. Sometimes I even forget where the heck I parked it. So I'm writing a little piece of software that basically, when I park the car, I can just send a text message to the system saying, here's where I parked it. And it will remind me, it will text me back or call me, you know, 15 minutes before, saying, here's where the car is, go move it, right? And also, you know, if I've forgotten where the car is, I can ask it, where did I leave the car? And it'll tell me, right? So, you know, that's a piece of software, but there's literally like, but you know, there's like 9 little individual steps I have to figure out. And just the other day, I was, you know, working on the sort of part where it lets you, where you text it, you know? And so I was setting up the system called Twilio, and I hadn't done this before. I mean, I'd done a Twilio thing years ago. I've kind of forgotten everything I ever learned about it. So you have to sort of dive back in there, and your head is really, really deep up that. And I'm not thinking about anything else like in the world, and not even in that software base, right? I'm no longer thinking about the rest of the problem. I'm just so heads down on that problem and getting that to work. And this is really, you know, there's a real, it's like as I say, it's a creative thing. It's like, it reminds me of the trance that novelists or poets or artists get into, where the rest of the world drops away and they are utterly obsessed with the problem. It's also like, it's complicated. It's a complicated thing to do. So it can take you some hours. If it's a very complicated thing, what I was doing was not that complicated. But if you're doing something very complicated, it might take you several hours to even begin to sort of recognize what's going on and load the problem into your head. And then you really want 8 or 9 hours. Like once it's there, you want to keep on working and you don't want to stop. You know, this is not like piecework, where you can do one every 30 seconds, one every 30 seconds. If someone interrupts you, that's fine. They talk for 5 minutes and you go back to one every 30 minutes. If someone interrupts you in this, it's all gone. Like you have to spend 3 hours getting back to where you were before. So it's very interesting. It is engineering work that resembles the creative work of a poet.
That's fascinating. In the book, you talk about one of your interviewees being irritated at having to go eat something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no. Bram.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, Bram Cohen, the creator of BitTorrent. He would get so deeply into a problem he was solving that he would become starving and ravenous, and he had to go eat, but it just felt so onerous to have to stop and do this. He said this. We were in his kitchen, and he was making a peanut butter sandwich, you know, which was like, you know, he's like, this is the simplest, fastest thing you can make. And he said, I wish that I was like that I was just like the Terminator in the second Terminator movie, where you see it just removing, you know, the plutonium core and putting a new one into its chest, you know, so it can keep on going. He's like, that's what I want. and he's not unusual. I mean, like lots of coders I spoke to, you know, were sort of annoyed by the need to drink fluid or eat because it just interrupted what they were doing. And they would find, you know, they find all sorts of ways of just clustering, you know, terrible food around their desk so they can just keep on going for hours.
Well, you have a wonderful visual in the book where you talk about going to one of these companies and you go to the marketing department and it's all, you know, My Little Pony and sparkles and everybody's running around and it's great.
Oh yeah, and they're all like flossing because their teeth have to look good, right? You know, no, I'm not kidding. Like they all have floss in their teeth.
But then you go to where the coders are hanging out.
It's utter silence. Yeah, it's utter silence.
Yeah, and they got
everyone's got their head. Nobody's talking. If they're talking text to one another. And yeah, it's like monastic silence. I was in the like the kind of coder floors for Meitan, which is a Chinese internet giant. They do like e-commerce. And I was visiting there about 5 years ago, and he's, we'll give you the tour. So, we went from floor to floor, and there's a sales floor, and there's a service floor, which has people on the phones talking. Then went to the coding floor, and it was big. This is a big company. There's like hundreds of developers. And yeah, it was absolutely, you could have heard a pin drop when we got to that floor.
Wow. It's amazing. It's amazing. Were there any things that really surprised you in the book?
Yeah. The big surprise in a weird way was, I think, or maybe not a surprise. Yeah, it was a surprise. Like, I had spent a long time, 20 years before I wrote this book, talking to developers and, and knowing about them. And if you'd asked me, what are the sort of, what are the kind of attributes of a coder? Like, what are the things you kind of have to have in your makeup if you're going to thrive at this? I would have said the obvious ones. I think that anyone would say, we have to be very logical. You have to think logically, if this happens, then that happens, you have to be, maybe a good systematic thinker, because you have to think of like every little step along the way of something. You have to break it down. And, it's as if you were writing a recipe for cooking eggs, but you had to explain how to use a fork, right? Like, that's the level, like that's like, imagine writing a recipe for how someone's going to eat breakfast, but you have to explain how to open a fridge, and you have to explain how to crack an egg, and you have to explain how to turn on a stove. That is what programming is, right? But what I did not expect in a weird way, even though I maybe knew it in the corner of my mind, was a central role of being able to endure frustration. Because the thing about coding is that it is probably more frustrating than anything I've ever seen anyone do. And this is counter to our popular Hollywood portrayals of it, where, if they show a coder, it's someone who sits down and they just start typing and the code comes flowing out of them and it works, right? And that's not at all what happens. Like, the first thing, if you try and run something of any complexity at all, like more than like, I don't want to use lines, because sometimes 10 lines can be non-complex and one line can be very complex, but whatever. But let's just say, a couple lines of code you've written, very frequently it doesn't work. It throws some sort of an error, and like, this is not code that like is 10 years old that someone else wrote it and you're not sure what's going on. You just wrote those lines and they don't work. And that is the typical experience of coding, right? Like, that is like 99% of the time, because something you hadn't thought about the way the data structure works, or you didn't understand the software library that you're trying to use in some way. And the software doesn't, and the programmer, the compiler, what they call the compiler thing, it's actually taking the software and turning it into ones and zeros for the machine. It gives you an error message, but it's often extremely convoluted to figure what's going on. You're Googling it and trying to figure out what's going on. So it is a constant hitting of roadblocks all the time. And the roadblocks are very, it's uncertain how long it's going to be before you figure it out. It might be 15 seconds. It might be 15 minutes. It might be 15 days, right? Like, the errors that you encounter are and this is a little weird, right? Like, I mean, in journalism, if I am having trouble figuring something out, I can sort of estimate, well, I need to call 10 people and one of them will know, right? And so that's like a day and a half of work. Like, I can figure out how long it's going to be before I solve that problem. But with software, with the barriers, you sometimes really have like, you hope it's going to be fast, but sometimes it just goes on forever. And like, so this is like, what chases people away from coding is not, there's a lot of things that chase them away. Let's leave aside any demographic stuff. Let's leave aside, any questions of whether or not the industry as it is inviting enough to people, of all walks of life. Let's assume that, put those up to the side. The people that tend to thrive in coding, you could actually probably do okay if you weren't the most logical thinker. You could probably do okay if you weren't the most systematic thinker. You don't need any math. The vast majority of coding doesn't have you doing anything more than counting to 10. Like, you can be absolutely terrible at math, does not matter for the vast majority of coding, not for blockchain, not for AI that needs math. The rest of the stuff I do, creating little web services for myself, I don't need any math at all. But you need to be able to endure unbelievable, terrible frustration that has no immediate end in sight. And even when you succeed, even when you get something right, you go back immediately to frustration, right? And that is a very, very weird thing. Very few, I've interviewed people from hundreds of different industries over my 25 years in journalism, and I've never seen anything that's quite that bad. Maybe customer service over the phone, right? But that was a surprise. I did not expect that to be such a decisive factor as to whether or not someone thrives in coding. And I also did not expect it to continue the experience to continue. You would think, well, if someone gets really good at coding, they're going to get better and better. They're going to have less frustration. I mean, in one sense, yes, the easy stuff, they can recognize the problems more quickly, but they're now doing more ambitious things. And so they're having bigger problems, and it just never stops. It never, ever stops. So sometimes when I'm talking to kids, about coding, I'm like, don't worry about anything else. You'll figure it out. But, this experience of frustration you're about to have is normal. It's typical. In fact, it's not aberrant to coding. It's what coding is. Coding is the ability to get past something that you have no idea what's going wrong. That is the absolute essence of coding, basically. Everything else is just window dressing, is something you can learn. But that predisposition is remarkable. So that was the big surprise, I would say.
That's and you do that's a theme that runs throughout the book. You're making me think of my PhD days, which was I did at the Wharton School, and one of my jobs was running analyses using a thing called SPSS on a mini computer, and the way that programming language worked was you had to have semicolons. It's totally counterintuitive to me. Why a semicolon? Why not an exclamation point? Who knew? And there was no way of quickly finding whether or not you had semicolons in your thing. And the way it would work I'd go to the lab, I'd be doing my programming, and back in the day, right, you didn't just have your printout or anything. It went to the printer room, and you had to go to the printer room where the goddess of the printer room lived, and you were only allowed in there at certain points of the day, and there was no screens, so you had to actually run the program, get it printed out, wait till the printer room open, get your print. As you said, it's
unbelievably brutal. It chases people away. You can very quickly see people who are like, oh, this is what this is. I don't want to do this. I don't find this endurable. Or the pleasures at the other end are not high enough to bring me through it, basically. And it chases me away all the time. I start working on a little project that I think would be kind of interesting, some tool I want to do, and I run into a problem. And the problem is so baffling that I can't figure it out in a few hours. And I come at it a day or two later. But sometimes I literally drift away because it's too depressing to sort of go back into that. And I never get
it's not like you hit the print button and you're done, right?
And that never happens with journalism, right? I never just stop working on something because it's hard, because because there's a linear progress. I know if I make X number of phone calls, I will find it out. And that is not true with the programming I do.
That's right.
It could, something that I can't figure out might remain a mystery for God knows how long. And even though I really like coding and I do it hobbyist a lot, that stops me in my tracks sometimes. Yeah.
Wow. So one of our listeners would like to know what advice you would give to parents of younger children on the sort of video game to coding to whatever. Is there a progression you would offer them?
Here's the thing about coding is this. When I talk to kids who got into coding, there's a couple things that they all sort of had. One is, they had the opportunity to sort of fiddle around with it and figure out if it really appealed to them, and I don't think it appeals to everyone, right? In fact, it probably only appeals deeply to a minority of kids. So the trick really is in figuring out, giving your kid the opportunity to sort of figure out whether or not they get hit by that lightning bolt, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so depending on how old they are, there's a lot of one of the nice things right now is that there's an awful lot of really fun little languages to teach them in, like one that a lot of people start with is Scratch, which is this terrific little language for like letting you it's at MIT, and it's basically you do it in the browser and you can sort of drag little blocks of code together to create like, you know, really fun little on-screen animations or bots that talk to you, or it's actually quite open-ended. It's a fantastic language. It's sort of a good way to sort of see if you like this task of getting machines to do things, right? And there's a lot of resources online, videos. There's a lot of sort of online clubs or things like that. So I often encourage parents to sort of, you know, show the stuff to their kids and just see if they gravitate to it. If they don't, it might mean that they just don't particularly thrilled to it, which is fine, right? You know, or, you know, you might expose them, you know, to it, you know, later on in life. There's all sorts of weird gateways. Like, for example, and the other thing like about coding that I think is significant to think about is like, there is this thinking of it as like, well, you're going to learn, if you're interested in this, then what you're going to do is become a software developer, right? But in reality, when you look at how people interact with code, one of the most interesting things is that there's this massive population in the workforce of people that do a little bit of coding, like the way you did at work, but you were not a software developer, but you needed to do a little bit of this stuff. And so I often encourage people, and this is adults, not even just like kids, is like, think about like things you're doing at work that are repetitive or boring, and you have to do them all the time and involve a lot of repetitive action. Like, I have to constantly take the values out of these Microsoft Word documents and input them into a spreadsheet. And I spend an hour on that every second Thursday. And that is something that you can learn like a very little bit of Python, like it's a very simple language, and learn how to like open a Word file, find those things, copy them, open the Excel document and drop them in. Like, that's Python's really, really good at that, right? You know, and you might spend like weeks and weeks figuring out how to do that. But once you've done it, you never have to do that task ever again. And in fact, actually no one in your company does either. And what if there's 100 people that do that? Well, that's 100 hours a week. So you've just saved your entire company 100 hours of people that are paid God knows how much an hour, right? And so there's this fascinating world of people that are not in any way coders, but learn just this bare minimum to sort of create some little script. And one of the fun things is, because the world is moving toward things like Google Docs and Google Sheets and whatnot, well, Google actually has built-in little scripting tools that let you figure out very quickly how to do these little things, or how to write like an auto replier for Gmail. If a certain things comes in, just send this back automatically. So there's this kind of world of like programming adjacent behavior that is all about just automating boring crap. And this is programming, right? But, you know, you're not a software developer making apps and, you know, and spending your time on this. Like, you are a real estate agent, you are a nurse, you are a marketing person, you are a journalist, you know, but you do a little bit of this stuff because it makes your life and the life of your organization better. And so sometimes people say, well, should I learn programming as an adult or a kid? I'm like, well, you know, you could try it, but make your goal not making some sort of app and releasing it, but finding one little crazy thing in your life. Like, for example, I'm not a professional software developer. I don't want to become one. I do it for fun and to sort of do exactly this, to find things where there's something in my life that's pain in the ass that I want to automate that no one else in the world is going to do for me. And about a year ago, I mean, I had spent 20 years organizing my to-do list in a way that I've never seen anyone else on the planet do. And maybe it's common, but I'll have like 9 different projects going on, and each of them has 7 items. So when I sit down, I don't work on just one thing. I go, the first thing I do is going to be in this project. The second one's going to be in this project. Then I go back up the number of people for the first project, and I skip like that. Then I've got 10 things I'm going to do, and I go through it. And I wanted software that basically let me make that list, but then quickly see just the top 10. Does not exist. Does not exist. I've looked everywhere. So I made it for myself. And it, you know, took some days. I mean, it was latticed on weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, or months or years of learning coding. But now I have a piece of software that does exactly what I want to do, and that no one else, as far as I can tell, on the planet needs it to do, right? You know, but that's and it's amazing for me, right? So I'm like, we're not accustomed to thinking of creating software for an audience of one, right? but that's sort of what like an enormous amount of personal software coding is like. And I think it's kind of interesting to sort of think about coding in that way. So we drift a little far from kids. The short answer is find something fun to show them, see if they like it. If they don't like it, don't push it. Observe whether or not there's other things they get into later in life. Like, for example, I knew a lot of kids who they got into music and they started making websites for their friends. And well, that's a real gateway drug. At that point in time, it's like, okay, well, maybe you should learn a little bit of JavaScript so you can do interactive stuff with this, or you could hook up like, Spotify's player so it's right on the page, or maybe add like, start to add stuff to build it out. Like there's all these fascinating gateway drugs. Or Minecraft, which is like, like it's hilarious. Like if you want to run like a Minecraft server for your friends to come into, you sort of have to learn, a lot about what anyone would call being a sysadmin, being a system administrator, right? So like one of my sons runs servers for his friends to go in, and he has basically had to develop all these skills that I myself don't even have of system administration, like, doing backups of the system, figuring out how to refresh it, figuring out how to like whitelist people and whatnot, install different packages. And like, people don't think of that as software behavior or coding behavior, but it absolutely is. This is exactly what, people do when they do system administration on any backend system. So a lot of what your kid's doing that might not look like coding adjacent behavior really is, right? Whether that's messing around with websites, whether that's messing around with certain types of video games. But I mean, but one of the main things is not everyone wants to do it full time for a living, and not everyone should. There isn't enough need for it. But there is this very interesting world, this mammoth iceberg beneath the water of like coding like behavior in everyday life that I think is completely worth thinking about, including for all the people who are just adults listening to this right now.
So in the book, one of the last chapters is, I think you called it blue collar coding.
Yeah.
And about coal people, people that work in coal mines being taught computer programming and so forth. And to me, one of the interesting, there's a lot that's fascinating about that particular chapter, is kind of, how transferable is that skill set, and should we stop being so snotty about who can actually master these skills? Right. But we've also got this, trend kind of going along with this of the whole no code movement.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And when you talk about coding adjacent behavior, what people are starting to do now, and I mean, I see it on like online courses, right? They'll put together, so they'll go to like a website like Thinkific or something, and they'll snap together like stuff that's available out there, sometimes free, sometimes not, but they produce something that used to have to be done by code. Now, is that something you see continuing? And then does that change who's in the mix? Who's in the
yeah, absolutely. The no code thing's really fascinating, because I mean, what it really is like, it's a recognition that a lot of sort of, if you had an idea for a company, normally you might, if you're like, well, I need people to log on, and I need them to, send an order for a type of work, and I need to store that somewhere, and I need to assign that automatically, email that out to a contractor, and then when it's done, I need to issue them an invoice, and a lot of this you would have hired a programmer to make all that for you. But those are all like things that you can go to, some of these no code operations and find little things, like, okay, I want a login system. You can sort of, you don't really need to know how to build it. You can sort of just say, put this in place. And I need, a way to bill people. And there's a lot of ways to do that. So this is something where like you can cobble together some fairly simple, like sort of lattices for a company that can definitely get you up and going, and maybe be all you need, like maybe you need to actually take things out of this one bucket and cut and paste them into a spreadsheet, but who cares? Like that, like that's the one piece of grunt work you can do. The rest of the software is basically made for you, right? And maybe eventually down the line, if this company takes off, you'll hire a software developer to sort of make that little final stitch for you, whatever. But like the ability to sort of just get up and running very quickly. I mean, in one sense, like, like blogging engines like WordPress are no code things, right? Because, before that came along, if you wanted to make a website, you had to write the HTML yourself, line by line. Mm-hmm. And what blogging engines said was, well, that's repetitive. We can do that for you. You just fill the box in with the text, and we will add all those tags. That is no code. That is low code, right? You know, so like this idea, and of course that caused an explosion in people blogging. And same thing with Flickr, same thing with like, you know, eventually, you know, all these different sites, things for making websites. So yeah, I think you're going to see more and more of these things, you know, come along that allow people to do stuff that allow people to do basic stuff without needing to really know a lot of coding at all. I think it's terrific. Absolutely.
But do you see that changing the mix of who's in?
Oh yeah, no, it already has. I wrote about this for Wired about a year ago, and it was all like, it was all people who demographically would not be the ones you'd find in a computer science program, probably, maybe because they were older too. Particularly, there was people making career shifts in their 30s or 40s who were like, well, I have an idea for a company, but like, could I actually make it? And it turns out they really can, right? And that's incredibly interesting. The ability to sort of be someone who doesn't think of themselves as a software developer, maybe doesn't even think of themselves as an entrepreneur, but is able to do this by sort of learning it. And it's kind of funny too, because like, you know, first you had these no code operations, and then you had like 10 years ago, you saw the rise of what they call coding boot camps, where the idea was, you're not going to go into a computer science degree because you're 29 or you're 34 or you're 53, but you want to learn coding so you can get a job. And so you go to a coding boot camp, which is like 4-6 months, whatever, and you're going to learn just enough coding to get a job as a junior developer. Didn't always work. Not all of them were good. The good ones, actually, they did work, but there was a lot of fly-by-night operations, very irregular. You're actually seeing no coding boot camps now, where it's small, it's short, it's like 1 week. It's like you go into it for 1 week and they just show you how to use these tools to snap it together to make a little online service, right? And that's incredibly interesting, right? So it's, you don't even have to, you can get an on-ramping to figuring out, you know, how to use these things to make a tool. And so you know, we're just sort of seeing these structures put together, educational and technological, that open it up to people from all different walks of life that not normally would have, you know, thought of doing a software defined project, shall we say.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's one of the most fascinating inflection
question.
points that we're going through. And so you couple that with the pandemic and other.
Yes, everyone's stuck at home and needing to figure out maybe a new way to make a living. Absolutely.
Right, yeah. Right. You know, I think that's very important. So just, and I want to leave coding for just shortly, but before we do that, so these social effects. You know, is there anything that can be done? I mean, is there anything that should be done?
Right,
you talked about the difference between heart monitors and social networks. So maybe there's a model there.
I mean, like there's one large intervention that I think would have significant positive effects, which is antitrust enforcement. So, you know, one of the problems that we have in the world, in the civil world, the civic world, where you have public conversation brokered by social networks. One of the problems we've got is that there is, like, we talked earlier about how Facebook is ungovernable because it's too big. Like, ungovernable in the sense of there is no person, no matter how smart, that could thread that needle, you know, that could figure out how to establish rules for hate speech in Malaysia that will map onto hate speech in Brazil, right? So, you know, what any antitrust scholar would say, well, this is a problem of bigness, and so the answer is they need to be smaller. There needs to be real. Right now, there's no competition, no serious competition for Facebook. A couple of years ago, there was this big thing about how, well, everyone's leaving Facebook. Where are they leaving? They're leaving for Instagram. Yeah. And so what Facebook did was it leaned into making Instagram a core part of Facebook itself, to the point where now if you log on to Facebook on the desktop, all they're doing is shoving people's stories at you, right? You know, because they saw that, right? So these companies, you know, have become monoliths that probably need to be at least threatened with, in a significant way, i.e., in a trial, threatened with being broken up, because right now you don't have a nice competitive landscape. There is no one that is currently trying to make a major social network. I mean, like I have not encountered any entrepreneur in like 5 years whose goal is to make a major new social network. They're like, there is no point doing it, right?
There's one guy in France who's trying to do a Google-like thing without the tracking and the ads.
In a weird way, I actually think it's much easier to make a new search engine than to make a social network. Because a search engine, because the quality of the search engine does not depend on millions of people using it, right? I could make an amazing search engine. If I had one customer, it would be amazing for them. But if I make an amazing social network and there's one person on it, it's utterly useless.
Right.
Right. You know?
I often say if you're the only person on a dating site, like unless you are the world's biggest narcissist, it has no value.
So the problem is that we don't have any competition, and the market is not going to create that competition. It is not. And historically, we know what we've done with this. We've brought in antitrust law. We said, okay, you guys are too big. This is now causing harms to society. And part of the problem is we need to reorient how antitrust law is thought of. I mean, so Cory Doctorow, the author, has been pointing out for some time now that antitrust law went off the rails post Robert Bork in the 80s, because he basically, before then, antitrust law was like, well, is this causing harm to the marketplace and the society? In that case, we need to break this company up. And Bork said, no. The only thing to worry about is it causing higher prices for the customer, right? And all antitrust law, particularly because it's, for a bunch of reasons, certainly, conservative pundits loved that argument because it meant that antitrust law would be applied almost never, right? Because monopolies are actually often very good at making things cheap. Their harms are not in the price. Their harms are in closing off competition. Their harms are in dominating a labor pool in a way that distorts labor. Their harms are in externalities like pollution. So basically, we need to go back to the pre-Bork version. This is what Cory's been arguing, and I think he's absolutely right. We need to go back to the pre-Bork analysis of antitrust, which is to say, a company becomes a problem. Its size and dominance becomes a problem when it creates, knowable harms for society. And all these large companies are doing that. So you're seeing the first antitrust blow against Google. You could absolutely bring one against Facebook without any difficulty. Now, when I said you need to bring a serious one against them to scare them, you maybe don't even need to break them up, because Microsoft in the 90s had an antitrust law case brought against it because it was attempting to kill internet companies like Netscape. And if they had been left unmolested to do this, you probably wouldn't have had Google. You might not have had Facebook. Microsoft is big enough to have choked all this stuff off. So we owe the current internet landscape to that antitrust suit, but it did not actually break up Microsoft. It wasn't broken to pieces, but it scared the living hell out of Bill Gates. And he said this on the record. He said, for the next 10 years, I was so worried about another antitrust suit that they let competition bloom. They did not step on things. They did not Bigfoot things. And lo and behold, this became good for Microsoft because they didn't crush Linux. Linux became huge. And now one of the most pro Linux companies on the planet is Microsoft, to the point where they bought and own GitHub, which is the major archive for allowing software developers to collaborate on open source software, a concept that Microsoft also tried to crush in the 1990s, right? So they are now just making money hand over fist off stuff that they were trying to crush in the 1990s. They became a better company for themselves and for the rest of the world because they were put on the stand and had the living crap scared out of them. And probably, I would argue, need to do the same thing with all these major internet giants. There are many smaller interventions we could talk about, but that's the big one that has the biggest impact.
That's great. So I'm mindful of the time, and I wanted to touch on just one other subject about your work. Which is, I remember watching a pie chart that you did, I think for a class, and explaining how much of your time you actually spend writing versus
that's right.
doing other stuff. And I think it would be interesting to those who are interested in journalism and how this job formerly known as journalism actually works.
Yeah. Well, I mean, keep in mind, I'm a specific form of journalism. I write big, long magazine pieces. And so I publish irregularly, infrequently, once a month for Wired, once every couple months for Smithsonian, once every maybe 6 months or more for the New York Times Magazine, a major feature. infrequently for also major features from Mother Jones, and major features for Wired. And so when you're doing a really, really big piece, 8,000 words long, it might take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years to pull off, right? And so most of the work really is in the reporting. Like I might talk to 80, 100 people for a story, and then really only end up quoting in the story like 9 of them. But I needed to learn enough to be able to be authoritative and to bring in the not just an anecdote, but the perfect anecdote, and so that's why I often I point out that, like, if you were to look at the half of my job that is writing, most of it's just reporting, and very little of it is actually writing. I spend very, very little, like 5% of my year is spent, at the keyboard. It's really learning, reporting, reading, and reporting. And the other half, the other 50% of it is actually mostly, and this is really, in one sense, what I'm employed for. I'm not really employed to write a report. Anyone can do that. I'm employed to figure out what to write about. And that's really, really hard because one of the things about magazine writing is you're rarely, because it's so slow and so long, it's not reactive. By reactive, I mean, if I asked you to write a piece this afternoon about the election, you would be reacting to what's happening right now. And that's good. Like that's an important thing for society to have reactions. But if I say to you, Clive, you're going to write a magazine piece, it's going to come out 9 months from now. There is no point reacting to anything, because you don't know what people are going to be talking about 9 months from now. So what you're doing is you're proposing. You're saying, I'm going to tell you about something that you've never heard about before, that you didn't think you needed to know about. And I'm going to make you very, very interested in it. But that's really hard to do, because most of what people do is consume reactive media. They're mostly interested in knowing what to think about something that's right in front of them. Exactly. It is very, very hard to get them to stop and say, I want you to spend 2 hours thinking about something that you are unaware that you need to know about. That requires an enormous amount of persuasion. So you have to have, again, not just kind of an interesting story. You have to have the most interesting story. You have to have not just some reporting, you have to have the best possible reporting anyone can get. And so that's why, like, the name of the game really is in finding those things. Like, I spend most of my time just looking around. Yesterday I just spent a couple hours on the phone doing some interviews for something that I might write or I might not. I need to find things, and the only way you can figure out if they're really rich and chewy is to start doing reporting. I mean, most of the time, by the time I figured out something that I think I might want to write, I've done enough research that I could write a 2,000 word newspaper piece about it. But I might decide at that point in time, nope, this isn't something I should write about, and the whole thing just goes in the trash can, right? So it's a very weird form of journalism, to do, like, it can feel enormously wasteful and to do like this massive amount of reporting for stuff that never sees print, or if you write the story, it's not directly in the story. But it's the only kind of way. It's kind of the only way to do it. I mean, I'm not unusual in this regard. This is how all magazine reporters work, basically. Yeah.
So I want to be mindful of your time. Where do people go to learn more?
You can go to, I'm most active on Twitter. So you can go to Pomeranian99. And I have a website that's got links to all my books. You can go and get them there. Opportunity. Go get. I really need one. Speaking of coding, I need to go in and like create an archive of my actual journalism, because you can kind of Google Clive Thompson Wired, Clive Thompson New York Times, Clive Thompson Smithsonian, Clive Thompson Mother Jones, whatnot. You can find it, but I don't make it easy, and I feel like I probably should. So I need to sit down and just like redo my website one of these days to actually have links to all my journalism. But anyways, there's my website and Twitter, the two main things. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. This has been absolutely wonderful, and I hope the conversation gets continued in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care.